2026 has just started, and we already have two Yakuza projects to dissect, one of which is a long theorized remake, and the other almost a direct response to what preceded it. While Pirate Yakuza was a more experimental spin-off, both in tone and general execution, Dark Ties is what you get as the polar opposite to it. A story set in the 2000s, when the Yakuza were still running rampant and powerful, an experience confined to just good old Kamurocho, all featuring an up-and-coming member of the underworld at the helm. It felt like the makings of a return to form. So, was this new spin-off genuinely worth the hype? That's the question I'll try to answer today, at least from my perspective. Put on your sharpest suit, cause we're going back to 2007 to see the birth of a legend. If you're familiar with this channel, you'll know I've praised Mina's antics extensively, and I've also been exceptionally positive towards the concept of Gaiden games, but raised concerns over their longevity in RGG's release schedule if the formula remained the same. As if to address these specific concerns, Dark Ties, in many ways, deviates from a standard Gaiden formula. While it does feature an Akame network-style point system, a dual currency is not required for skill acquisition, instead focusing on a money-exclusive upgrade path, which is an excellent choice considering Mina's business background. The critical path may still have padding, as is to be expected of a Gaiden release, but the amount of it in the campaign is significantly lesser than in the previous entries. There are 3 points where the story will take a break, 2 of which occur in Chapter 2 and are mercifully short compared to the examples from Pirate Yakuza and especially Infinite Wealth, while the last case of filler is the only one that genuinely overstayed its welcome, as it required raising Kanda's reputation to level 6 in Chapter 3. It would have been easy for the filler here to mess up the experience at large, especially considering DT's shorter runtime. But even with the aforementioned Chapter 3 filler, the actual campaign in its totality was paced surprisingly well and actually showed attempts at improving on what came before. If you can't write a 20-hour story within the chosen premise, don't take 5 hours of substance and litter them with side content to reach the aforementioned number. Focusing on substance, with only brief bursts of downtime, is something that puts Dark Ties over both Gaiden and Pirate, as much as I love those games to bits. Beyond that, DT gives us control of an active Yakuza member for much of the campaign, despite the golden rule of Yakuza storytelling prohibiting long-time exposure to such a role for a lead. It also broke the rule of Gaiden games, needing to expand on the newest turn-based mainline, and instead brought back a variety of characters fans have been exceptionally acquainted with for the past 17 years. Lastly, in the department of formula deviation, there's the fact that this game doesn't apply the dual-style combat philosophy that became the go-to for the series since the Kaito files, and instead gave us one core moveset and an altered iteration through Dark Awakening. All of these changes, at least in concept, are a good choice, which is why I went for Dark Ties over K3 when deciding on which entry to review first on the channel. It is also a campaign I wound up being very positive towards, in stark contrast to my mixed feelings on K3, but we'll cover that another time. Now that we've gone over some general talking points, we can finally move on to more specific sections of the analysis, starting with the combat. Mina's combat is something that I'm kind of mixed on, but leaning closer towards the positive side overall. To start off with a nitpick, it was a missed opportunity to technically omit his quote-unquote alternate styles that were present in the boss fight from OG3, which included an orange, red, and purple heat state with a variety of moves only present during those stages of the fight. It would have been amazing to see an expansion on those nuggets of substance into self-sufficient styles. But hey, if the team felt like they couldn't make another adequate style to properly accompany the shootboxing, then it might have ultimately been for the best to stick to one. Now, what about the shootboxing itself? Is it just a carryover of the classic spike-out moveset that's been reused in most Yakuza entries following 3? Well, yes and no. It may not be a one-for-one of the classic moveset, cause that would have been pretty bare bones for modern Yakuza standards, even if we exclusively observe them through the lens of budget releases, but surprisingly, almost every move from Mina's OG boss fight is technically accounted for in DT's combat system. More often than not, the old animations return wholesale. just being parts of proper combos rather than being used as one-and-done moves. And once this foundation was set, RGG filled out the remaining blanks of its toolkit with a handful of moves from other beat-em-up games that felt like an apt fit for Mine. The obvious example would be the cues from LJ's wall attacks, using them to create a quote-unquote enemy step for Mine, but not in the DMC sense of the term. Given that he is one of the most agile fighters in RGG's catalog, this choice does fit him, albeit teetering on the edge of questionable asset reuse from my angle. The same could be said about a variety of heat actions taken from either Yagami or Akiyama, though this particular reuse pales in comparison to that of entries like the original Judgment, even when you consider how that game was developed in close proximity to Kiwami 2, thus copying the majority of its heat actions. There's also moves like the flying knee attack from Kiryu's brawler style, returning as the charge attack for Mine, but in my opinion, the presence of old moves can be excused if done in an adequate context, which mostly rings true for Mine's overall toolkit. Combat speed is amazing from the start, and perfect dodges make it even better after adequate skills are required. The addition of critical hits and the aura break felt fun to work around from the get-go, which is something I can't really say for Kiwami 3, despite the existence of two styles in that campaign. While we're on the topic of adequate context though, there is one question I'd like to ask whoever was in charge of either the combat design or lead programming in DT specifically. So, you have 7 rush combo variations in the default style, but 4 of them have an identical finisher, this either being a double triangle input or a triangle square input, while combos 5, 6, and 7 offer unique finishers by comparison. Did RGG aim to go the dial a combo route with their moveset here, a la something like Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, to allow for a never-ending barrage of attacks, or was this a coincidence? It makes you wonder if giving Mine 4 rush combo iterations with unique finishers for all of them would have been a choice more befitting of a standard Yakuza combat system compared to what we have here, but that's just hypothesizing on my part. The concern is that the end result now will likely lead to blind button mashing for many players in beginner and maybe even intermediate levels, unless you go out of your way to mix things up for the sake of personal enjoyment and creative expression. Though considering RGG's core demographic, and perhaps largest portion of consumers, the approach they went with may have fully been intended, though this is a discussion for another time. Back to the more positive side of things, DT mitigated some missteps from Pirate Yakuza, finally bringing back grounded heat actions, letting the player pick enemies back up to continue comboing them, multiple heat bars are back, and the list goes on. The fact we also have a variety of held button inputs with unique properties to them, different running attacks and reversals, alternate versions of dodge attacks depending on the direction of the dodge, a perfect guard and perfect dodge, along with the aforementioned rush combo variations, there's clearly stuff to love about this system, meaning that a good player will definitely make something amazing with the tools given to them. As for Dark Awakening specifically, funnily enough, it feels like RGG had 2 ideas for Mine's core moveset, with DA being the version that could have replaced the default one we have and still leads to a great combat loop. It feels amazing to use, yet due to its apparent similarity to the default style, this would risk DA coming off as bloat if it were implemented as a freely selectable style through conventional style switching in its current form, like if Kiryu in Yakuza 0 or Kiwami could only switch between Brawler and Dragon. Back to the point. The fact that the altered rush combos in DA have different properties to them depending on the number of HUDs consumed is an interesting premise, reminding me very slightly of the gear system from Yakuza 0, though with plenty of extra steps. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of these what-if scenarios stemming from the combat system could have been addressed if this game, and K3 itself for that matter, were given adequate development time and resources. It would also explain some strange cuts in DT, like the absence of equipable gear in any form, the lack of a legend difficulty, and the inability to use environmental weapons, though the last one may be a stylistic choice after all. Despite the issues that I raised, the end result of DT's combat is one that I'll likely keep experimenting with long after the launch period, even more so if there's an item granting you infinite meters, or if there is a means of skipping select animations from DA, like how you could skip certain startup animations in Gaiden's agent style, examples being Firefly and Spider. In conclusion, Mina's moveset may be pretty streamlined compared to the more involved combat systems of the franchise, but unlike K3, it feels like every move here had a clear purpose behind its implementation. So while it would benefit from more polish, what we have here makes for a fun time, at least for me. Next up, we have a general overview of the story. Thankfully, despite my familiarity with RGG Online, I never looked into the translations of its character events, which would have spoiled me on the narrative of Mine Gaiden. Its story adapts the contents of the Man Called Yoshitaka Mine event that took place between July 19th of 2019 and July 31st of the same year. This means that this is the closest that we got to a quote-unquote Nagoshi-era narrative since LJ, as the man who wrote the core of Mine Gaiden, that being Kazunobu Takeuchi, was involved in writing characters and arcs reminiscent of the darker Yakuza stories from the older era of the studio. Even his more recent writing contributions include standouts like Yamai as a whole and the Arakawa Rampage scene from Infinite Wealth, and he is also confirmed to be involved in Stranger Than Heaven. From the get-go, this meant that we would be in good hands, because I'd say that we haven't had a story like DT happen in a while, since Judgment, or to a lesser extent, Kiryu's Gaiden. The actual story beats make for an interesting collage of RGG's writing styles. On the one hand, the presumed camaraderie with Kanda that was commonly showcased in the early trailers doesn't undermine the reveals of OG3 regarding their falling out. If anything, it just makes this eventual outcome make even more sense due to the continuous building of frustration from both Mina's and the player's perspective. It gives you a sense of conflict that you have to abide by the wills and wants of a disgusting human being for the sake of your personally defined goals in search of an idealized future. You were basically left with nothing at the start of Dark Ties, so having the aforementioned descriptors form the path for a future willing to travel down is an excellent call. This isn't a Kiryu story or an Ichiban story. There's a lot more discomfort and despair present in Mina's evolution. On the other hand, there are also some glimmers of hope present to balance out the tone. The developing admiration towards Daigo has so much substance to it because not all of it is directly said for the player to see, or for either of these two characters to hear from one another. There is conflict preceding the forming of a meaningful bond. Each of their meetings bookends an important part of the campaign, and while both of them have concerns they don't directly express, this makes the culmination of the story feel so bittersweet and only makes the ending of OG3 even better as a result. The only real sticking point with the story of DT would be the very last cutscene, for very understandable reasons, as this is also an addition that completely deviates from the original RGGO story. It's an issue of DT needing to adhere to Kiwami 3's narrative deviations, and if you fall into the category of having the ending of a story be the determining factor of its quality, you might completely despise DT because of this. Personally, even with the objectively bad writing choices present, even a scene like that couldn't undermine the quality of the writing preceding it, partially due to the open-ended nature of said resolution, but this is a topic that we'll cover more in depth once more info on RGG's future storytelling is finally revealed. Lastly, regarding the flow and general length of Dark Ties, it reminded me a lot more of the Kaito files than it would Kiryu's Gaiden or even the Majima saga, as some would compare it to in a rather unflattering light. The substance of this release is frequently undersold by reviewers, and granted, labeling DT as a fully fledged game was indeed a poor choice in the marketing, as people would likely imagine this to be a 20-hour experience as a result. But looking at this campaign exclusively through the length of the critical path is to miss the point on why so many people took issue with the filler in Kiryu's Gaiden and Pirate Yakuza. This game has the content to keep you engaged, and it doesn't beat you over the head with it to the extent of the latest RGG releases. It also gives you a lot more to do in premium adventure than either the Kaito files or the Majima saga ever could, alongside actually featuring a New Game Plus mode, which also puts it over the original Gaiden, as well as the aforementioned campaigns, in a lot of ways. DT, at least for my first playthrough, felt like a thoughtfully constructed experience, and one that I'll replay with pleasure over a number of other campaigns from the past 20 years of the series. As for the cast of the game, which would normally be its own dedicated section of the review, there isn't too much to add here that hasn't already been expressed. The returning characters were written faithfully to their iterations from OG3, and the portrayal of Daigo and Mine in particular was a pleasure to see. The new character of the game, however, presented as the acting Nishikiyama family patriarch, is one that's been somewhat of a disappointment, according to fan discourse. Personally, I think he does exactly what he needs to, and in a better way than Pirate Yakuza's final boss, whom I also consider to be better than the public discourse would paint him to be. Ikari is consistently written. He is not a grand obstacle to surpass in terms of physical prowess, but in terms of symbolism. Anyone could have driven Mine to this point by acting the way he did, and the emphasis of this encounter is on Mine's own development. So giving a character like Ikari the red carpet treatment in this boss fight, with multiple QTEs and alike, actually would have contradicted the deliberately restrained choices of his writing. It also wouldn't have suddenly made people love the boss, looking at the final fight of Pirate Yakuza as a counterpoint, where the individual had weaker writing than Ikari, but a spectacle of a final fight, and was still forgotten about by the community in the grand scheme of things. In short, while I get the disappointment with him, the only form of a fight that would have made for a more fitting conclusion to this campaign would have been a flash forward to the fight against Kiryu, and we all know that was never going to happen in playable form. Anyway, I think Kajiji introduced the optimal figures to bring the story to a desired endpoint, and I adored it because of that. Moving on to the OST, I think the composers went down an excellent route. As was already stated, this is a game taking place in 2007, for the most part, and is an experience that dabbles in a variety of dark elements, even when looking at the title alone. Now, when I think of the 2000s, in terms of music, I think of my favorite rock and metal albums and artists. Dream Theater, Trivium, System of a Down, Duran Grey, The Gazette. There's so much great music here, and it feels like the selection of tracks in Dark Ties fits into this, admittedly broader group of artistry almost seamlessly. We're back to the heavier undertones of Kiryu's Gaiden, which is most apparent in tracks like Nowhere to Go, Fury Unchained, and Alone in the Darkness, especially once that last track really kicks in. It's exactly what you need to get you in the mindset of fighting through hordes of enemies with reckless abandon. It's the most prevalent element of the soundtrack, but it's not the only one. You also have some tracks that feel sonically reminiscent of the PS3 era of Yakuza specifically, like Pride of Steel and the default combat theme, Dark Alley. I normally wouldn't recommend adhering too closely to past signature styles, given how the series steps out of its comfort zone quite frequently. But given that this is a spin-off for one of the quintessential PlayStation 3 Yakuza games, I'd say throwing in some leitmotifs and invoking comparable emotions to those of that era is a good thing to do in moderation. Naturally, the electronic elements of recent Yakuza experiences are also accounted for in some capacity, usually being tied to the arena side activity, with my favorite of those being Hell Brawl. Strangely enough though, while all of the tracks named are solid in their own right, I think the biggest standouts of this OST would be some of the calmer songs to balance the general chaos of the remaining tracks. Looking at a beautiful ballad like Smoky Last Gleam, or the vocal track Sandcastle that was prominently featured in the reveal trailer. It may not be on the same level as I'm Fading Away and Now or Never, but it has its own identity, focusing less on the finality of life or the treasures that await in a promising future, but rather on a never-ending pursuit that always leaves you empty, pondering if you're too far gone due to the amount of time dedicated on the wrong people and the wrong pastimes. Adding in the jazzy undertones, reminding me of Crazy Ken Band in some places, alongside a subdued hip-hop flow in the verses, worked out better than I would have anticipated, given how a track like Katatoki from Kiryu's Gaiden, which had some slight similarities to this approach, took a while to connect with me, which wasn't the case with Sandcastle. In essence, just give these tracks a spin, and see if you find something you resonate with moving forward. You might be pleasantly surprised. As for exploration, this will be a fairly short section. The only map here is Kamurocho. There's no castle, no island exploration, no secondary map, etc. You can find standard suitcases around town that give you healing items or stuff like gold plates, which is a given, but that's about it. Even then, I'd say this is far from the worst version of Kamurocho, by nature of fast travel from the map being readily available to you, and stuff like the vending machine tech allowing you to despawn enemy encounters if you're in a pinch. The things that set this map apart from the others are the unique environments, most notably Hell's Arena and the variety of challenges present, as well as the highly hilarious, yet comparably unfortunate, Kanda damage control system. This is the first time that an Akame Network-esque implementation was present in Kamurocho, as this is the first Gaiden game to take place here. And due to this game's KDC system, you will have a variety of optional mini-bosses at your disposal and the general means of obtaining vast amounts of money through simple side activities at every point in the story. The aforementioned system is also tied to the completion list and sub-stories, all of which incentivize being observant during your time on the streets. So while it is very by the book, it works like a charm for a short spin-off like this. Oh yeah, and you can also change between 3 costumes in Premium Adventure, those being the IT look, the standard suit, and shirtless Mine. Lastly, while the following could technically be listed under the side content section, I'd rather cover the sub-stories here due to how they contribute to the different vibe of this version of Kamurocho. Similarly to how 3's Kamurocho was its own thing with a unique tone in its side and sub-stories, seeing the 07 version of the district through Mina's perspective specifically gives it these darker undertones that set it apart from even the Yakuza 3 and K3 versions of Kamurocho. I imagine that the thought of Mina dealing with conventionally comic shenanigans that are usually synonymous with sub-stories would induce fear in many fans, but the sub-stories in DT are actually closer to some of the earliest games in terms of sincerity. Mina intervenes on a surface level because helping the Nishikiyama family means furthering his personal goals, and once he comes across some sub-stories, he doesn't just help the people involved due to a sense of altruism. He stomps out a spark before it turns into something worse, and leaves the people involved to make a decision. If they end the conflict through their own violent means, they prove that they are no better than the Yakuza, meaning that helping them out beyond a surface level would have been a waste. Should they take the high road though, Mina finishes the job himself, sometimes without them even knowing it. You have the example of the sub-story with a serial killer on the loose, where the brother of a victim has to determine whether to take a life, or alternatively, the story of the corrupt cop forcing a rookie to do illegal dealings to keep his job. Even the way some of the lighthearted stuff was implemented here genuinely makes sense, like the one where a bunch of people turn into violent drunks, pushing their reenactments of Yakuza and pirate movies too far. Unlike some of the modern Yakuza sub-stories, you don't end up joining these people. You reprimand them succinctly, cause they're genuinely bad for business, and the drunks are banned from the bar afterwards, so there's no happy ever after, everyone is best buds type of resolution present. This is 2000's Tokyo, and it finally feels that way after so long. Brief side note, as I've just finished everything in Dark Ties, but there is a handful of sub-stories that stand out from what I described. I'm obviously talking about stuff like the Panty Thief and the Dragon Ball Collectathon sub-story that's been around in most of the more recent games. I get that they're mainly here to tick proverbial boxes, so that not all of the 13 activities are the exact same tonally, but while I do enjoy the idea of putting a serious person like Mina into such bizarre setups, it's a bit too out there, compared to everything else in DT specifically. At least the Golden Ball sub-story is consistent with Mina wishing for eternal bonds most of all, despite the humorous resolution, and the thief activity adds the only playable chase section of the game in here. Having said that, the majority of the sub-stories are still consistent with what I described earlier, but I felt inclined to bring up these outliers regardless. Anyway, let's get back on track. Now that we properly got to the section regarding side content, what's the deal with the Colosseum here? After all, this is one of the biggest drawing points to a Gaiden game, looking at how the man who raised his name gave us a variety of playable characters to choose from, while Pirate focused on group encounters as well as its unique brand of vehicular combat. By comparison, DT's take on this Yakuza mainstay feels tailor-made for Mine, yet oddly nostalgic for me specifically. There are two forms of activities to partake in, one of them being survival hell, and the other a variety of classic cage matches titled Brawler Hell. Unlike some past Yakuza Colosseums that add this degree of class, in the presentation tied to underground matches, looking at Yakuza 2 and 3 for example, Brawler Hell feels like a mix of Dragon Heat from Kurohyo and the perversions of Club Stardust in Yakuza 6. It's just a brutal cage match where losing means death. People that enter the ring do it out of desperation, to get themselves out of a financial pit hole, and the people who pay to watch this are rich scum of the earth that are just here for their own enjoyment. There's barely any glitz and glamour here to speak of. This is the perfect place for Mine, cause he merely treats it as a financial opportunity and even a quick sparring spot, rather than this daunting experience despite the variety of casualties. The cage matches are precisely what you'd want to see, and make the Kiwami 3 Colosseum look like a beta test feature by comparison, whereas Survival Hell shows the different take to the Colosseum combat you would actually expect from a Gaiden game. It is essentially a roguelite mode, as you can collect a variety of gospels to improve your passive abilities. You're always on the clock. You have to navigate through the dungeons from the turn-based entries, and if you lose during any of the 3 phases present, you lose everything. You can even employ mercenaries to accompany you during your run, or use them as meat shields, alongside wielding unique weapons on cooldown if you need a panic button in between your search for healing items and collectibles. They even have fast travel here, which means you get to strategize on how many enemies you take down within a wave, and if you should keep exploring the floor for more gospels or unique pickups. It's really fun, and one of the many things that separates this game from its predecessors like the Kaito Files or the Majima Saga, especially in terms of replayability, like with the New Game Plus mode I already pointed out. Moving on to general side content, the brunt of it is just your average stuff. Darts, pool, betting, gambling, etc. With the only new additions, apart from the Colosseum, at least to my recollection, being bowling, which is bloody amazing, the Game Gear games, and the Print Club. Game Gear emulation is really cool for those with a particular taste for retro gems. Personally, I enjoy them more so for the novelty, as I haven't had extensive experience with the generation of games present here. But they still give you something different to do than what came before, which should be praised. Print Circle is, well, Print Circle, and frankly, the only part of the side activities that does feel ill-fitting for Mine. So if you take issue with this particular implementation, I'd say that's a completely fair assessment. On the other hand, the treatment that he got in the karaoke minigame has me feeling genuinely mixed, but for different reasons than you'd expect. It's not the choice of the song itself, but rather the fact that this is the only song for Mine. Hiseiyu sings Bakamitai beautifully, and actually gives it a unique identity worth of genuine praise, unlike the K3 Aqua version. But even then, the fact that this song, that's been around for 14 years in almost every single Yakuza game, is the only track given to Mine is such a missed opportunity considering the quality of his performance. He could have gotten a new song like Zhao and Jungi got in Infinite Wealth, and I would have been completely happy with it. But the major takeaway here is that the male vocalists don't have to rely on Bakamitai exclusively, just like the female vocalists don't have to rely on Like a Butterfly. Originally, I was going to leave off covering the brand new activities from the arcade here for the Kiwami 3 review, given that the activities present are identical in both games, and how K3 will be lacking in the territory of things to wholeheartedly praise. However, I will briefly mention them here, because one of the new minigames was one of the most pleasant surprises that I've had with the series in quite a while. So, apart from the usual DE arcade minigames, this release gave us 3 new activities to enjoy. One of them is Emergency Call Ambulance, where you race to a hospital on a timer, but with the added stipulation where every bump will lower the timer as a result of your patient's health condition worsening. It's simple, yet really effective for a high-score chase type of activity. The second one is Magical Truck Adventure, which is basically every rail-related chase scene from vintage cartoons, but in playable form. But then we have the last minigame, which is the pleasant surprise I alluded to earlier. Slashout is a game I first heard of through DT's completion list. It is not just a spin-off / fantasy sequel to the 3D beat-em-up classic Spike-Out, but it is also technically a hack and slash featuring a number of RGG Studio alumni, with the producer of the project being none other than Nagoshi Toshihiro. This was a pretty big deal for me. Since I first played Spike-Out through the arcade version in Infinite Wealth and realized the connection to both RGG Studios' past members and the direct carryover of select movesets into Yakuza, Mine being one of the most obvious examples of this, I've developed quite the fondness for this game. However, I never looked into the sequel history of it, so I had no clue that something like Slashout even existed before this. Given my well-chronicled adoration for the subgenre of hack-and-slash games called character action, you can imagine how excited I was to try this out. So what was originally planned to be just a quick visit to the arcade to capture a bit of footage for the review, quickly turned into an hour-long play session of just Slashout. The campaign consists of 5 stages. You can initially choose between 4 playable characters, and despite the simplicity of the controls and level design, it was just a really damn good time. There was something incredibly nostalgic about it, and I can't believe that this project eluded me for so long, cause now I finally went down the rabbit hole of past, Nagoshi-headed projects preceding Yakuza, which made me want to do a separate video documenting all of them in some capacity. Also, Sato Daisuke and Shoji Hidenori were involved with this project as well, so if you needed any more reason to try it out, either through emulation or whatever comes your way, I definitely recommend checking out Slashout. Anyway, to round this section up, there's a particular concern that was raised by a vocal minority regarding most of the side content present in this game. I've seen comments implying that the existence of standard Yakuza side activities being available contradicts the nature of Mine as a character. Like he's not supposed to show an interest like karaoke and should instead either be completely bereft of relaxing activities or have his side content be exclusively of a financial variety, a la giving him an investment minigame. Putting aside the massive hit-or-miss nature of Yakuza's finance minigames, looking at you, Real Estate Royale, it should be noted that Mine is not just this, and I hate that I have to use this accursed word, Sigma, who only focuses on money and solitude, because that would greatly undermine his writing, especially in this stage of his character evolution. He said back in OG3 how he joined the Yakuza looking for legitimate bonds between people. The last thing that regular life gave him was essentially being let go from the company he started. And after that downfall, he finally met Daigo. You see a person like this in charge of a group, and you foolishly think that things will be different in the criminal underworld. Hence why Mine letting loose in certain activities actually makes sense for him here. He tried his best to actually bond with other people, even bloody Kanda at this point, because that was really all he had. And knowing what we know of his future in Yakuza 3, it just makes the existence of things like his karaoke endeavors even more tragic by comparison. This is not the calm and collected Mine we see in the majority of OG3. This is the era before his fleeting sense of idealism is finally broken. And that's why the light-hearted nature of select activities makes sense. Also, the fact that the Colosseum is the place where you'll spend most of your time in the side content means the aforementioned activities don't suddenly turn a dark campaign into a tonally dissonant experience by comparison, when looking at the totality of the game. I still wish that there was more stuff unique to Mine present here, but the trip to 2007 Kamurocho, in the shoes of a technically new protag, gave me almost everything that I wanted, which was a relief considering some of the reviews preceding this particular spin-off. As for any negatives, there's obviously all of the stuff that I already brought up, like the nature of the final cutscene, the lack of an original karaoke song, addressing some of the strange combat decisions, etc. I think this release would have generally benefited from being a separate entity from Kiwami 3, as it would have lessened the number of comparisons to the Majima saga and solidified that this is a self-sufficient campaign, albeit shorter than the previous Gaidens. Also, small nitpick, but it would have been cool if the game had a secret unlockable style a la what was done in Yakuza 0, cause that could have given players an incentive to go for 100% completion in Dark Ties, but given the short development time, again, I get it. Oh yeah, and for the love of God, bring back Legend difficulty moving forward. Overall, Dark Ties, in many ways, feels like a project tailor-made for me, and one that better complements OG Yakuza 3 than the game it is packaged with in many ways. Despite the structural familiarity, it offers an experience that was memorable to me, and had this been a €10 self-sufficient entry, I probably would have purchased it alongside whatever Devil Jin-esque Mina statue a collector's edition would have come with. But as you already know, this was a package deal, with a game far more risky to create and far more of a ticking time bomb as its launch drew closer. My thoughts on it are exceptionally mixed, to put it very lightly, and the reason why I can't fully recommend giving this release a shot unless it's through the free-to-play demo. Because of this, giving Kiwami 3 a separate video felt right, and I hope you'll look forward to the critique that will follow. That aside, let me know your thoughts on Dark Ties and whether it was what you expected it to be. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you again. So, until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers!